There is a specific kind of silence that exists in the old samurai quarters of Japan, a silence that feels heavy, disciplined, and slightly mournful. It is not the silence of a graveyard, but the silence of a fortress that has outlived its purpose. If you stand in the Nagamachi district of Kanazawa or the black fenced lanes of Kakunodate on a gray, drizzly morning, you can feel it. It is the atmosphere of a world that spent 3 centuries preparing for a war that never came, only to be undone by a peace it didn't know how to navigate. In the final decades of the shogunate, Japan was a map of these castle towns, jokamachi. They were social blueprints made of wood, stone, and clay. Every gate, every curve in the road, and every species of tree planted behind a wall was a physical manifestation of rank. But by the 1870s, the fabric of these towns began to fray. This is the story of the last samurai districts, the places where the clock stopped and the streets that eventually vanished under the relentless march of a new, concrete Japan. The geography of paranoia. A samurai town was never designed for the convenience of its inhabitants. It was designed to be an enemy. If you were a stranger attempting to reach the lord's castle at the center of the city, the very streets would conspire against you. The layout followed a principle called Mawigamichi, the winding road. There were no long straight vistas. Instead, streets ended abruptly in T-junctions, or twisted into sharp 90-degree bends known as masugata. These cranked corners were strategic traps. They broke the momentum of a charging army and forced intruders to expose their flanks to archers hiding behind the high, tiled walls. Even the bridges were tactical, often made of light wood, designed to be burned or dismantled in minutes, leaving the castle an island in a sea of broken connections. The air in these districts was different from the rest of Japan. In the merchant quarters of Osaka or the theater districts of Edo, the air was thick with the smell of grilled eel, cheap sake, and the chaotic noise of haggling. But as soon as you crossed the canal into the bukyashiki, samurai housing, the temperature seemed to drop. Here, the streets were wide and surfaced with compacted earth and fine gravel that crunched rhythmically under wooden geta sandals. There were no shop signs, no shouting vendors, and no open windows. Life happened behind walls, thick, yellow clay structures topped with dark, heavy tiles. These walls were the face of the samurai. They were pristine, silent, and impenetrable. The only sounds were the rhythmic clack-clack of a wooden practice sword from a hidden courtyard, or the wind whistling through the meticulously pruned black pines. The anatomy of the gate. In a samurai town, your house was not a home. It was a statement of your lord's favor. The most important feature was the mon, the gate. For a high-ranking vassal, the gate was a massive structure called a nagayamon, or longhouse gate. These were essentially barracks built into the perimeter wall. Lower-ranking guards and servants lived inside the gate itself, literally sleeping within the walls to form a human barrier between the street and the master's inner sanctum. The heavy timber doors, reinforced with iron studs, were opened only for formal departures. For daily use, a small, humble side door was used, a reminder that even the elite lived under a code of constant surveillance and restraint. Behind these gates lay gardens that were masterpieces of functional beauty. They were not flower gardens in the Western sense. They were landscapes of moss, stone, and evergreen. Many samurai planted nanten, heavenly bamboo, near their gates, a play on words, as nanten sounds like turning hardship into luck. But there was a darker utility too. Many gardens contained hidden escape paths or nightingale floors, uguisubari, that chirped when stepped upon, alerting the household to assassins in the dark. The Great Silence. 1868 to 1876. The end did not come with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing realization. When the Meiji Restoration returned power to the emperor in 1868, the legal framework of the samurai world dissolved, but the physical world remained. For a few years, the samurai towns existed in a state of eerie suspension. The turning point was 1876, the year of the Hitori Edict, which banned the wearing of swords. To a samurai, the sword was his soul. Without it, he was merely a man in expensive, outdated clothes. When the swords were removed, the spine of the samurai town snapped. The decay was specific and heartbreaking. Because the samurai were no longer paid stipends by their lords, they had no money to maintain their sprawling estates. The pristine white plaster of the walls began to crack and peel, revealing the mud and straw beneath. The long gates, once symbols of power, began to sag. In the most prestigious districts, a strange sight appeared. The elite warriors of Japan began to plow their ancestral gardens. To avoid starvation, families that had once spent their days studying tea ceremonies and calligraphy were now growing sweet potatoes and radishes between their ornamental rocks. Highborn women, who had lived their lives shielded from the public eye, began taking in laundry or selling family heirlooms, centuries-old armor and tea bowls, to the very merchants their fathers had once looked down upon. The erasure of the past. As Japan modernized, the samurai districts were viewed as embarrassing scars of a feudal past. The new government wanted brick, stone, and gaslight, not wood, clay, and shadow. In cities like Tokyo, the erasure was near total. The vast estates of the daimyo, lords, were confiscated and turned into government buildings, military barracks, or parks. The winding defensive streets were straightened to make room for horse-drawn carriages and, later, electric trams. The cranked corners were rounded off. The canals, once the defensive arteries of the castle towns, were filled in with rubble and paved over. The samurai towns were uniquely vulnerable to this progress because they were built of wood. Unlike the stone castles of Europe, a Japanese manor could be dismantled in days. By the 1890s, most of the great bukyashiki had been replaced by Western-style villas or cramped urban housing. The physical memory of the samurai was being ground into the dust of the new industrial empire. The accidental survivors. Today, the few samurai districts that remain are accidents of history. Towns like Kanazawa, Hagi, and Kakunodate survived not because of a desire to preserve them, but because they were far enough away from the centers of industry to be forgotten by the developers. Walking through the Nagamachi district in Kanazawa today is the closest one can get to time travel. In the winter, the residents still hang komogake, straw mats, over the mud walls to protect them from the freezing rain and snow, a technique unchanged for 400 years. You can still hear the rush of the Onosho Canal, which was diverted into the district centuries ago to provide water for firefighting and to feed the private ponds of the warriors. But even these preserved districts are fragments. They are museumized versions of a reality that was much harsher and more complex. They lack the smell of the horses, the smoke from the kitchen fires, and the underlying tension of a society where a wrong word could lead to a ritual suicide. Conclusion: the ghost in the stone. Most visitors to Japan flock to the neon of Shibuya or the shrines of Kyoto. They see the Japan that was rebuilt after the fires of World War II, or the Japan that has existed for 1,000 years. But the Middle Japan, the Japan of the samurai town, exists in the shadows between the two. It is a world that exists in the texture of certain streets. It's in the way a road suddenly narrows for no apparent reason, or the way a stone wall seems to have been built to withstand a siege that happened 2 centuries ago. The last samurai towns were not destroyed by an invading army. They were outgrown. They were built for a specific type of human being, one who valued honor over profit and ritual over comfort. When that human being disappeared, the towns had no choice but to follow. Now, they survive only as ghosts, waiting for a quiet morning and a perceptive traveler to notice that the silence in these streets isn't empty. It's just waiting for a master who will never return.